beacon of my GPS flickered once, twice, then died. In that instant, my world shrank to the size of my headlamp's beam, and the vast wilderness of the Caucasus Mountains swallowed me whole. I've always prided myself on being a capable solo climber. The solitude, the challenge, the raw connection with nature, it's what I live for. But as I stood there on that narrow ledge, watching the last traces of daylight bleed from the sky, I realized how quickly hubris can turn to horror. The day had started like any other on this expedition. I woke before dawn, my breath creating misty clouds in the crisp mountain air. My tent, a bright speck of blue against the rugged landscape, had been my home for the past week as I tackled the lesser-known peaks of Georgia's Veneti region. I broke camp efficiently, my movements automatic after years of practice. The weight of my pack settled comfortably on my shoulders as I adjusted the straps. A quick check of my GPS confirmed the route I'd planned the night before, a challenging ascent up an unnamed peak that locals simply called the Needle for its sharp, imposing silhouette. The first few hours of the climb were exhilarating. The rock face was technical but not impossible, requiring full concentration as I picked my way up, testing each hold before committing my weight. The physical effort kept me warm despite the thin air that bit at my lungs with each labored breath. By midday, I had made good progress. I paused on a small outcropping to refuel, fishing an energy bar and my water bottle from my pack. As I ate, I took in the view. The valleys below were blanketed in mist, and jagged peaks pierced the clouds in every direction. The isolation was complete and intoxicating. It was during this break that I first noticed something was off with my GPS. The screen flickered intermittently, the coordinate numbers jumping erratically. I tapped it a few times, chalking it up to the cold or maybe a low battery. It seemed to stabilize, so I pressed on, eager to reach my targeted camping spot before nightfall. The afternoon brought deteriorating conditions. The wind picked up, howling around the rocky spires and buffeting me as I climbed. Clouds rolled in, thick and gray, obscuring my view of the summit. I should have turned back then, but summit fever is a powerful thing. I convinced myself I could push through, that the weather would clear. It didn't. As the light began to fade, I realized I had badly miscalculated. The GPS was now completely unresponsive, leaving me without my planned route or any idea of my exact location. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the first few flakes of snow began to swirl in the air. Panic rose in my throat as I scanned the cliff face, looking for any suitable place to make an emergency camp. There, about 50 feet above me, a small ledge that might offer some protection from the wind. I started climbing, my movements now hurried and less precise. Twice I nearly lost my grip, my hands numb from cold and fear. I hauled myself onto the ledge just as true darkness fell. It was narrower than I'd hoped, barely wide enough for me to sit with my back pressed against the mountain. I fumbled with frozen fingers to set up my emergency bivvy, a thin layer of protection against the elements that were now unleashing their full fury. The storm raged through the night. Wind screamed past my little sanctuary, and snow accumulated in drifts around me. I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, my dreams filled with falling and the sound of my own desperate cries for help. Dawn broke gray and forbidding. The storm had passed, but a thick fog clung to the mountain, reducing visibility to mere feet. I was completely disoriented, unsure even of which direction would lead me back down to safety. My supplies, meant only for a day climb, were dangerously low. I had to move. Staying put meant certain death from exposure or starvation. With leaden limbs, I packed up my meager camp and began a cautious descent. Every step was a gamble. The fog played tricks on my eyes, making drops seem shorter than they were, hiding treacherous patches of ice until I was almost upon them. Hours passed in a haze of concentration and fear. The fog showed no signs of lifting, and I had no way to know if I was making progress or simply wandering in circles on the mountain face. My water ran out around midday, and thirst soon became a constant, gnawing companion. As afternoon faded into evening, despair began to set in. I was utterly lost, my strength fading, and the temperature was plummeting again. I needed to find shelter for another night, but the smooth rock faces offered little in the way of protection. It was then that I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I must be imagining it. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, a whisper on the wind, almost like voices. My heart raced. Could there be other climbers nearby? Or was my mind, addled by dehydration and exhaustion, playing cruel tricks? I called out, my voice hoarse and weak. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The wind whipped my words away, but I thought I heard a response, too indistinct to make out, but definitely human. Hope surged through me, giving me a burst of energy. I began moving toward where I thought the sound had come from, my movements now rushed and careless. That's when it happened. My foot, numb from cold, missed a small ledge. I felt myself falling, tumbling through the fog. There was a moment of sheer terror, then impact. Pain exploding through my left side as I slammed into an outcropping. I came to rest on a narrow shelf of rock, the breath knocked from my lungs. As I lay there, gasping, I became aware of a warm wetness spreading across my ribs. My probing fingers came away red. I was bleeding, though how badly I couldn't tell through my layers of clothing. Darkness was falling fast now, the fog taking on an eerie, luminous quality in the fading light. I knew I couldn't move, not in my condition, not in this visibility. I had to wait out another night and pray that morning would bring clear skies and rescue. As I huddled there, shivering uncontrollably, the voices came again. Clearer this time, but still maddeningly indistinct. They seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the rocks. I called out again and again, my pleas growing more desperate with each unanswered cry. The night deepened, and with it came the cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my thoughts growing sluggish and confused. In my more lucid moments, I was gripped by the certainty that I would die here, alone on this uncaring mountain. It was during one of these moments of clarity that I saw it, a pinprick of light in the distance, barely visible through the thinning fog. At first, I was sure it was a hallucination, a last desperate fabrication of a dying brain. But it persisted, steadily growing brighter. I fumbled for my headlamp, hands clumsy with cold, and managed to switch it on. I waved it back and forth, trying to signal. "Here!" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here!" The light grew closer, resolving into a powerful beam that cut through the mist. And then, like a miracle, I heard a voice, clear, strong, and blessedly real. "We see you. Hold on, we're coming." Tears streamed down my face as I saw the first climber emerge from the fog, followed by 3 others. They were speaking rapidly in Georgian, but I caught phrases like "lucky" and "thought you were dead." As they worked to stabilize me and prepare me for evacuation, I learned the full story. A local shepherd had reported seeing flashes of light high on the mountain the previous night. My futile attempts at signaling. The alarm had been raised, and this team of expert climbers and rescue workers had been searching for hours. The descent was a blur of pain and relief. By the time we reached the base camp, where a medical team was waiting, I was barely conscious. But I was alive, snatched from the very brink by the skill and bravery of my rescuers. Weeks later, as I recovered in a Tbilisi hospital, I reflected on my ordeal. I had made nearly every mistake possible. Overconfidence, ignoring warning signs, pushing on when I should have turned back. The mountain had taught me harsh lessons about respect and humility, but it had also shown me the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the profound kindness of strangers. The voices I heard, whether real or imagined, had kept me going when all seemed lost. And in the end, it was the dedication of my rescuers that brought me home. I know I'll climb again. The mountains are in my blood, but I'll carry this experience with me always. a reminder of both the dangers and the wonders that await in the high, lonely places of the world. And I'll never again take for granted the thin line that separates adventure from disaster, or the importance of a guiding light in the darkness. The sound of ripping fabric echoed across the mountain face, followed by a scream that chilled me more than the biting wind ever could. In that instant, I knew our climb had become a fight for survival. I've been climbing with Alex for years. We're more than just partners on the mountain. We're like brothers. We've shared triumphs, close calls, and more than a few beers around campfires. But nothing in our years of experience could have prepared us for this moment, hanging thousands of feet above the ground, connected by a single, fraying lifeline. The day had started with the kind of perfect clarity that makes you feel invincible. We'd been planning this ascent for months, a challenging route up the north face of Mount Olympus in Greece. It wasn't the highest climb we'd ever attempted, but the technical difficulty and the mountain's mythological significance made it irresistible. We hit the trail before dawn, our headlamps carving twin paths through the darkness. The approach was grueling, a steep hike that had us shedding layers despite the cool morning air. But as the sun rose, painting the surrounding peaks in hues of gold and pink, any discomfort faded away. This was why we climbed, for moments like these, when the world fell away and it was just us and the mountain. The real climbing began mid-morning. We moved efficiently, years of partnership evident in our wordless communication. A slight nod here, a hand signal there. We read each other's intentions as clearly as if they were spoken aloud. The rock was good, offering solid holds, though some sections required delicate balance and complete focus. We were about halfway up the face when we paused for a quick break, anchored to a small ledge. We gulped water and munched on energy bars, our legs dangling over a dizzying drop. "How you feeling?" I asked Alex, noting the sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool air. He grinned, that familiar spark of excitement in his eyes. "Never better. This route is everything they said it would be." I nodded in agreement, but something nagged at the back of my mind. The weather report had mentioned a possibility of afternoon storms, though the sky remained clear for now. "We should pick up the pace a bit," I suggested. "I don't like the look of those clouds building to the west." Alex agreed, and we set off again with renewed purpose. The climbing became more challenging as we ascended, the holds smaller and farther apart. We were in the crux of the route now, a series of overhanging sections that required every ounce of strength and technique we possessed. I had just cleared a particularly difficult pitch and was setting up an anchor when I heard it. A strange, scratching sound from below, followed by a muffled curse from Alex. "You okay down there?" I called, peering over the edge. Alex's voice came back strained. "Yeah, just something feels off with my harness. It's digging in weirdly. Can you make it up to me? We can check it out here." He nodded, and I watched tensely as he started to climb. He was about 10 feet below me when it happened. There was a sudden tearing sound, and Alex's eyes went wide with panic. "My harness," he yelled. "It's giving way." Time seemed to slow down. I saw the webbing of Alex's harness start to unravel, the stitching popping apart under his weight. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing our rope with both hands just as Alex's harness failed completely. The shock of his fall nearly ripped me from the wall. Pain exploded through my shoulders and arms as I took his full weight. For one terrifying moment, I thought we were both going to plummet to our deaths. But somehow, miraculously, my anchor held. "Alex," I shouted, my voice ragged with effort. "Are you all right?" There was a moment of horrible silence before his shaky voice floated up. I'm okay." Jesus Christ, that was close. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. We were in a desperate situation. Alex was dangling free, held only by the rope I was clinging to. My arms were already burning from the strain, and I knew I couldn't hold him indefinitely. "Can you swing over to the wall?" I called down. "Try to find some hold." I felt the rope swaying as Alex tried to maneuver himself. After a few agonizing minutes, he called up, "I've got a foothold, but it's not much. I can't climb like this." My mind raced, assessing our options. We were too high to descend safely with our limited gear, especially with Alex's compromised harness. Our only choice was to continue up and hope we could reach a wider ledge or a possible rescue point. "Okay, listen carefully," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fear gnawing at my gut. "We're going to have to share my harness. I'm going to pull you up, and you're going to have to clip directly into my belay loop. It's not ideal, but it's all we've got." What followed was the most grueling and terrifying hour of my life. Inch by excruciating inch, I hauled Alex up to my position. My muscles screamed in protest, and more than once I feared my grip would fail. But finally, mercifully, he was level with me. With shaking hands, we managed to secure Alex to my harness. We were now inextricably linked, our lives literally hanging on a single piece of equipment. The closeness was awkward, our bodies pressed together on the narrow ledge. But the shared warmth was comforting in the face of our dire situation. That's when I felt the first drop of rain. I looked up to see dark clouds rolling in fast, much quicker than I had anticipated. The distant rumble of thunder sent a spike of fear through me. A storm at this height, in our condition, could be fatal. "We need to move," I said grimly. Now, climbing in our bound state was a nightmare. Every movement had to be coordinated, and the slightest misstep by either of us could send us both plummeting. The rain made the rocks slick, adding another layer of danger to our already precarious ascent. We had maybe another 500 feet to go before we reached the summit plateau, where we might have a chance of finding shelter or signaling for help. But as the storm intensified, each foot gained felt like a mile. Lightning began to flash around us, far too close for comfort. The thunder was deafening, and I could feel Alex trembling against me. From cold, exhaustion, or fear, I couldn't tell. Probably all three. "We're not going to make it," Alex shouted over the wind, his voice cracking. "We should try to find a ledge. Wait it out." Part of me knew he was right. We were exposed, moving far too slowly in dangerous conditions. But another part of me, the part that had gotten us through countless tough situations before, refused to give up. "We're almost there," I yelled back, "just a little further." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. We were still at least an hour from the top at our current pace, and the storm was only getting worse. The wind howled around us, threatening to tear us from the mountain's face. That's when I spotted it. A dark opening in the rock face about 50 feet above us. A cave, or at least a deep overhang. It was our only chance. "There," I pointed. "We need to get to that cave." Alex nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his exhausted features. With renewed determination, we started to climb. Every move was agony. Our muscles pushed well beyond their limits. The rain had turned into driving sleet, pelting us mercilessly. We were about 20 feet from the cave when disaster struck again. A bolt of lightning hit the rock face above us, sending a shower of debris raining down. I felt a sharp pain as something struck my head, and for a moment, the world swam out of focus. "Tom!" Alex's panicked voice brought me back. "Stay with me, man. We're almost there." I blinked hard, forcing myself to concentrate through the pain and disorientation. We couldn't afford a mistake now. Not when we were so close. The last few feet to the cave were a blur of pain, effort, and sheer willpower. When we finally tumbled into the relative safety of the overhang, I nearly wept with relief. We collapsed on the cold stone, our chests heaving as we gasped for breath. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The sound of the storm raging outside filled the small space. Finally, Alex broke the silence. "We made it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. "I can't believe we actually made it." I managed a weak chuckle. "Don't celebrate yet. We're still stuck on this mountain." As the adrenaline faded, the reality of our situation set in. We were alive, but far from safe. We had limited supplies, no way to call for help, and we were still tied together by a single harness. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and night would be falling soon. But as I looked at Alex, saw the determination in his eyes that mirrored my own, I felt a surge of hope. We had faced the impossible and survived. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. "What do you say, partner?" I asked, managing a grin despite everything. "Ready for another adventure?" Alex laughed, a sound of pure relief and camaraderie. "With you? Always." As we huddled together in that small cave, the storm raging outside, I realized that this was what true partnership meant. It wasn't just about sharing the triumphs or the beautiful vistas. It was about facing the darkest moments together, bound by something far stronger than any rope or harness. Trust, friendship, and the unshakable belief that together we could overcome anything the mountain threw our way. The night ahead would be long and cold, but we were alive. And tomorrow, when the storm cleared, we would find a way down this mountain, together. The first claw mark we found could have been anything, a bear maybe, or some overzealous hiker testing their knife. But as we climbed higher, the marks grew larger, deeper, and far too regular to ignore. Something was on this mountain with us, something that didn't belong. I've been leading climbing expeditions in the Cascade Range for over a decade, but I've never experienced anything like that ascent up Mount Baker. It started as a routine 5-day trip with a group of intermediate climbers, challenging enough to be exciting, but well within our capabilities. Or so I thought. Our team of 6 met at the trailhead early, on a crisp September morning. There was Mike and Sarah, a married couple in their 40s who had been steadily working their way through the highest peaks in Washington. Tom, a software engineer in his 30s who climbed to escape the pressures of his high-stress job. Aisha, a college student and the youngest of our group, eager to prove herself on her first major glaciated climb. And finally, Derek, a quiet man in his 50s who had taken up climbing after losing his wife to cancer 2 years ago. As we did our final gear check and shouldered our heavy packs, I felt the familiar excitement that always preceded a climb. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies and moderate temperatures for the next 5 days. We set off in high spirits, the conversation flowing easily as we made our way through dense forest towards our first camp. It was on the second day that we noticed the first strange mark. We had left the treeline behind and were making our way across a rocky slope when Tom called out, "Hey, Chris, take a look at this." I backtracked to where he was standing, examining a large boulder. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed 3 parallel grooves carved into the rock's surface. They were deep and even, unlike any natural weathering I'd seen before. "Weird," I muttered, running my fingers along the marks. "Probably just some kids messing around." We continued on, but I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. The marks didn't look fresh. They were weathered, as if they'd been there for years. But I was certain I'd never seen anything like them on previous trips up this route. We reached our second camp by late afternoon, setting up our tents on a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. As the others prepared dinner, I took a short walk to scout our route for the next day. That's when I saw it. Another set of marks, this time 5 parallel lines carved into a near-vertical rock face about 7 feet off the ground. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These marks were larger than the ones we'd seen earlier, and there was no way they could have been made by a person without climbing gear. And they were fresh, the exposed rock still pale compared to the weathered surface around it. I stood there for a long moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But since when did bears climb sheer rock faces? And the marks were too evenly spaced, too deliberate. I thought about telling the group, but decided against it. There was no point in worrying them, and we hadn't seen any signs of actual danger. Still, I resolved to keep a closer eye on our surroundings as we climbed higher. The next morning dawned clear and cold. We broke camp efficiently and started our ascent towards the glacier. The climbing was challenging but exhilarating, the kind of technical work that requires complete focus. For a few hours, I forgot about the strange marks as we navigate around crevasses and up steep ice slopes. It was Aisha who spotted the next set of marks just before we stopped for lunch. They were on a large boulder near our rest spot, and this time there was no mistaking their size or implications. The grooves were as wide as my hand and deep enough that I could fit my entire finger into them. What the hell could have made those? Mike asked, his voice tight with barely contained fear. I didn't have an answer. The marks were far too big for any animal native to these mountains. I found myself scanning the slopes above us, half expecting to see some monstrous creature looking down. It's probably just erosion or something, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Weird ice formations can do strange things to the rock up here. No one looked convinced, but what choice did we have? We were more than halfway up the mountain, and going back down now would be just as challenging as continuing to the summit. After a tense lunch, we pressed on. The afternoon brought deteriorating weather. Clouds rolled in, obscuring our view of the peak and dropping the temperature significantly. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow. I called for us to rope up as visibility decreased, not wanting to risk anyone getting separated. We were making our final push towards our high camp when Derek, bringing up the rear, let out a strangled cry. I turned to see him pointing off to our left, his face pale beneath his beard. Through a momentary break in the clouds, I saw it, a dark shape, moving with impossible speed across a snowfield about 100 yards away. It was gone in an instant, but the image burned itself into my mind. Something vaguely humanoid but far too large, its movements fluid and predatory. What was that? Sarah whispered, her grip tightening on her ice axe. I don't know, I said honestly, but we need to get to camp. Now, we practically ran the last quarter mile to our camping spot, a small flat area sheltered by a rock outcropping. As we hurriedly set up our tents, the snow began to fall in earnest, quickly obscuring our visibility beyond a few feet. No one spoke much as we huddled in our tents that night, the wind howling around us. I lay awake for hours, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate something approaching. But there was nothing except the storm. Morning brought clear skies, but a transformed landscape. At least 2 feet of snow had fallen overnight, making our planned summit attempt much more challenging. As we gathered for a quick breakfast, I could see the fear and exhaustion on everyone's faces. I think we should turn back, Tom said, breaking the tense silence. This doesn't feel right. Part of me wanted to agree with him. Every instinct was screaming that we were in danger, that we needed to get off this mountain as quickly as possible. But another part of me, the part that had faced down storms and avalanches and kept my clients safe, rebelled at the idea of giving up so close to our goal. We're less than 1,000 feet from the summit, I said slowly. The weather's clear now. I think we can make it up and back down to a lower camp today if we move fast. There was a moment of hesitation, then nods all around. None of them wanted to be the one to call off the climb. We packed up quickly and started our final ascent. The going was tough, the new snow making each step a challenge. But we made steady progress, our fear giving way to determination as the summit grew closer. We were about 200 feet from the top when Aisha, who was on point, suddenly stopped. "Chris," she called back, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." I moved up beside her and felt my heart drop. There, in the virgin snow ahead of us, was a single, massive footprint. It was easily 4 feet long and shaped like no human or animal foot I'd ever seen. And it was fresh. As we stood there, frozen in shock and fear, a low rumble echoed across the mountain. At first, I thought it was an avalanche starting, but then I realized the sound was coming from above us. Slowly, as one, we raised our eyes to the summit ridge. There it stood, a massive figure silhouetted against the bright sky. It was vaguely humanoid, but easily 10 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its face was something out of a nightmare, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a long moment, we stared at each other, 6 puny humans and this impossible creature. Then it threw back its head and let out a roar that shook the very mountain. "Run!" I screamed, and we turned as one, all thoughts of the summit forgotten in our blind panic. We half ran, half fell down the mountain. Our carefully planned descent turned into a chaotic scramble for survival. I could hear it behind us, its massive strides eating up the distance between us. Somehow, miraculously, we made it to the tree line without it catching us. As we plunged into the forest, I risked a glance back. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, watching us. Then, almost casually, it turned and loped back up the mountain, disappearing into the swirling snow. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead, our legs shaking and lungs burning. As we piled into our vehicles, casting fearful glances back at the mountain that now looked so innocuous in the afternoon sun, I knew that none of us would ever be the same. I've led many climbs since that day, but I've never returned to Mount Baker. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I dream of that massive figure on the summit ridge, and I wonder, with a mixture of fear and awe, what other secrets the mountains might be hiding. The first carving I saw was a simple spiral, harmless enough, but as my flashlight beam danced across the cave walls, revealing image after image, I realized I was looking at a story, a warning, and the final panel made my blood run cold. It was me, unmistakably me, facing a terror I couldn't yet comprehend. I've always been drawn to solo climbing. There's something pure about facing a mountain alone, relying solely on your own strength and judgment. But as I huddled in that hidden cave, a freak blizzard raging outside, I never felt more isolated or more afraid. The day had started perfectly. I'd been planning this ascent of Mount Rainier's Liberty Ridge for months, waiting for a stretch of clear weather to attempt the challenging route. When the forecast finally aligned, I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear, left a detailed route plan with the park rangers, and set off at dawn. The first day of climbing was everything I'd hoped for. The rock was solid, offering good holds as I made my way up the steep ridge. The views were spectacular, the entire Cascade Range spread out before me, peaks poking through a sea of clouds. By late afternoon, I'd made excellent progress, surpassing my planned bivouac site. That's when I noticed the first hints of trouble. Dark clouds were building to the west, moving in faster than any weather system I'd ever seen. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow. I knew I needed to find shelter, and fast. I scanned the ridge above me, looking for any kind of protected alcove. That's when I spotted it, a dark opening in the rock face about 200 feet up. It looked like it might be deep enough to offer real protection from the storm. I climbed as quickly as safety allowed, the wind growing stronger with each passing minute. Snow began to fall, fat flakes that quickly turned into a blinding curtain of white. By the time I reached the cave entrance, I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. Panting, I ducked into the opening, relieved to be out of the wind. I switched on my headlamp and was surprised to see that the cave extended quite a way back into the mountain. It was tall enough for me to stand comfortably, and wide enough that I couldn't see the far walls in the beam of my light. I set up my bivouac quickly, laying out my sleeping bag and firing up my small stove to melt some snow for water. As the cave filled with the comforting hiss of the burner, I finally allowed myself to relax a bit. I was safe, at least for now. It was as I was sipping my hot tea, letting it warm me from the inside out, that I first noticed the carvings. My headlamp caught a glint of something on the cave wall nearest to me. Curious, I moved closer to examine it. The spiral was carved deep into the rock, its lines smooth and precise. It didn't look particularly old. There was no heavy weathering or mineral buildup in the grooves, but it certainly wasn't recent either. I ran my fingers over it, wondering who had left their mark here and why. Intrigued, I began to examine more of the cave walls. That's when I realized the spiral wasn't alone. There were more carvings. Extending further back into the cave, I followed them, my sense of unease growing with each new image I discovered. The carvings told a story. That much was clear. They started simply enough. Stick figures climbing a mountain, not unlike the petroglyph-style art I'd seen in other parts of the Cascades. But as I moved deeper into the cave, the images became more complex, more disturbing. I saw figures fleeing from something, their postures conveying terror even in their simple form. I saw what looked like great storms, with lightning bolts and swirling winds etched into the stone. And I saw creatures, things that didn't belong on any mountain I knew. Hulking forms with too many limbs, beings that seemed to shift and change from one panel to the next. My hands were shaking as I moved from image to image. Part of me wanted to stop, to retreat to the safety of my sleeping bag and pretend I'd never seen any of this. But I couldn't look away. There was an urgency to these carvings, as if their creator had been desperate to convey a message. And then I saw it, the final panel. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was me. There was no mistaking the details. My distinctive climbing helmet, the patch on my jacket, even the scar on my left hand from a climbing accident years ago. The figure was rendered with a precision that seemed impossible for cave art. In the carving, I was standing at the mouth of a cave, this cave, facing something that made my skin crawl just looking at it. It was only roughly sketched, as if the artist had been too afraid to render it in detail, but I could make out multiple eyes, grasping tentacles, a maw filled with far too many teeth. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This was impossible. How could there be a carving of me here, in a cave I'd only discovered by chance? And what was that thing I was facing? A gust of wind howled to the cave entrance, making me jump. I spun around, half expecting to see some eldritch horror lurking in the shadows. But there was only the storm, still raging outside. I retreated to my bivouac, my mind reeling. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I was oxygen-deprived from the altitude, hallucinating these images. Or maybe this was some elaborate hoax, though I couldn't imagine how anyone could have created such detailed carvings in such a remote location. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, every sound magnified in my hyper-alert state. The storm showed no signs of abating, its fury seeming to grow with each passing hour. I found myself studying the cave entrance, watching for any sign of movement in the swirling snow. As the night wore on, I began to hear things. Scratching sounds, too deliberate to be loose rocks in the wind. Low, rumbling noises that seemed to come from deep within the mountain itself. Once, I could have sworn I heard something like speech, guttural syllables in no language I recognized. I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake suddenly, my heart racing. Something had changed. The storm had stopped, the silence as startling as the previous noise had been. Pale light was filtering into the cave. Dawn had come. I packed up quickly, my desire to get out of the cave warring with my fear of what might be waiting outside. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, I found myself drawn back to that final carving. In the gray morning light, it seemed less ominous, almost crude in its execution. Had I really seen what I thought I had in the darkness? I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was letting my imagination run wild. There were no monsters on Mount Rainier, no ancient evils waiting in the storm. I was an experienced climber who had let a combination of isolation, altitude, and some weird cave art get the better of me. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the cave. The world outside was transformed, every surface coated with a thick layer of fresh snow. The sky was clear, the storm nothing but a memory. I could see the summit of Rainier gleaming in the distance, tantalizing close. For a moment, I was tempted to continue my climb. The conditions were perfect now, and I was so close to my goal. But as I stood there, I felt a bone-deep weariness settle over me. And beneath that, a current of fear I couldn't quite shake. I looked back at the cave one last time. In the daylight, it was just a dark opening in the rock, showing no hint of the strangeness within. But I knew what I had seen. Whatever its origin, that carving had been a warning. And I, for one, was going to heed it. I turned and began my descent, picking my way carefully down the snow-covered ridge. As I climbed down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times I paused, scanning the slopes above me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until I was back below the tree line, the familiar forest closing in around me, that I finally began to relax. I made it back to my car just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As I drove away from the mountain, I found myself wondering if I would ever return to attempt that route again. Part of me said yes, the rational, daylight part that scoffed at the idea of ancient cave warnings and mythical monsters. But another part, the primal core that had kept our species alive through long, dark nights, whispered a warning. Some mountains, it said, are best left unclimbed. Some caves are meant to stay hidden. And some warnings, no matter how strange their form, should be heeded. I glanced in my rear-view mirror, watching Mount Rainier recede into the distance. In the gathering dusk, I could have sworn I saw something move across its slopes, something large, something that didn't belong. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put as much distance between myself and the mountain as possible. Whatever secrets that cave held, whatever truth lay behind those carvings, I knew one thing for certain. My days of solo climbing were over. Some challenges, I realized, are too great to face alone. The first time I saw it, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a reflection, my mind playing tricks after hours of staring at endless white. But as the night wore on and that thing kept appearing at the edge of my vision, I realized with growing horror that we were not alone on this mountain. I've been doing night climbs for years. There's something magical about ascending a peak under the stars, the world silent and still around you. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for that night on Denali. Our team of 4 had been planning this expedition for over a year. Megan, our lead climber, had summited Denali twice before. Tom was our resident gear expert, always tinkering with the latest climbing tech. Sarah was the youngest at 25, but she had an almost supernatural talent for route finding. And then there was me, Jack, the old man of the group at 40, with more big mountain experience than the rest combined. We'd spent weeks acclimatizing, slowly working our way up the mountain. Our plan was to make the final push to the summit at night, hoping to catch the sunrise from the top of North America. It was ambitious, maybe even a little reckless, but we were all in peak condition, and the weather window looked perfect. We set out from our high camp at 14,000 feet, just as the last light was fading from the sky. The temperature dropped rapidly, but our exertion kept us warm as we made steady progress up the ice face. The moon was just a sliver, leaving the stars to provide what little natural light there was. Our headlamps cut bright swaths through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We moved efficiently, each of us lost in our own thoughts, connected by the rope between us. The only sounds were the crunch of our crampons on the ice and our measured breathing. It was around 2 a.m. when I first saw it. We had paused for a quick water break, and I was scanning the slope above us, planning our next move. That's when I caught a flicker of movement just at the edge of my headlamp's beam. It was gone so fast, I wasn't sure I'd seen anything at all. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "See what?" Tom replied, looking around. I shook my head. "Nothing. Probably just snow blowing off the ridge." We continued on, but I found myself constantly scanning the periphery of my vision, waiting for that movement to reappear. And reappear it did, about an hour later. This time I was sure I wasn't imagining things. It was a dark shape, moving with impossible speed across the ice face about 100 yards to our left. "There!" I hissed, pointing. But by the time the others looked, it was gone. "Jack, are you okay?" Megan asked, concern evident in her voice. "The altitude isn't getting to you, is it?" I wanted to insist that I had seen something, but doubt was already creeping in. Was I imagining things? Was the thin air playing tricks on my mind? "I'm fine," I said finally. "Let's keep moving." But I wasn't fine. As we climbed higher, I kept seeing that shape darting in and out of my field of vision. Sometimes it seemed to be above us, sometimes below. Once, I could have sworn it was keeping pace with us, moving parallel to our path just beyond the reach of our lights. I tried to focus on the climb, on the familiar rhythms of ice axe and cramping, but my nerves were frayed, my concentration shot. I found myself making small mistakes, a poorly placed ice screw, a moment of lost balance. The others noticed, exchanging worried glances when they thought I wasn't looking. We were about 800 feet from the summit when things went from unsettling to terrifying. We had reached a particularly steep section, requiring careful navigation around a series of crevasses. I was bringing up the rear, double-checking our safety lines, when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the ice itself. I froze, my ice axe half buried in the wall. "Did you hear that?" I called up to the others. Before anyone could answer, I saw it again. But this time, it wasn't just a fleeting glimpse. The shape moved into the full beam of my headlamp, and for a moment, I got a clear look at something that shouldn't exist. It was vaguely humanoid, but much too large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body seemed to shift and flow, as if it wasn't quite solid. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me. 3 glowing orbs that fixed on me with an intelligence that was anything but human. I let out a strangled yell, losing my footing in my panic. I fell backwards, the safety rope going taut as it caught my weight. Above me, I heard shouts of alarm from my teammates. "Jack, what's happening?" Sarah called down. I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I tell them I had just seen some kind of impossible creature on the mountain? They'd think I'd lost my mind. As they helped me back into a stable position, I tried to collect myself. "Sorry, I managed. I thought I saw something. Lost my concentration." Megan gave me a long look. "Jack, if you're not feeling well, we need to know." There's no shame in turning back. Part of me wanted desperately to agree to get off this mountain and away from whatever was out there. But another part, the stubborn climber who had faced down storms and avalanches, rebelled at the idea of giving up so close to our goal. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Just a moment of vertigo. Let's keep going." We pressed on, but the atmosphere had changed. The easy camaraderie of earlier was gone, replaced by a tense silence. I could feel the others watching me, waiting for me to make another mistake. As we neared the summit, the sightings became more frequent. The shape, creature, whatever it was, seemed to be all around us. I saw it flitting between crevasses, moving with a speed and agility that defied physics. The others must have seen it too. I caught Tom staring wide-eyed into the darkness, and Sarah's hands were shaking as she placed an ice screw. But no one said anything. It was as if by not speaking of it, we could pretend it wasn't real. We reached the summit just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. On any other day, it would have been a moment of triumph, of breathtaking beauty. But as we stood there, the highest people on the continent, all I felt was an overwhelming urge to get down. The descent was a blur of terror and exhaustion. We moved as quickly as safety allowed, all pretense of enjoying the climb abandoned. The shape continued to haunt us, always just out of clear sight, but unmistakably there. It wasn't until we were back at high camp, collapsed in our tents, that anyone spoke of what we had seen. "So," Tom said, his voice shaky, "is anyone going to talk about whatever that was up there?" There was a long silence. Then Sarah spoke up. "I thought I was going crazy. You all saw it too. One by one, we shared our experiences, the fleeting glimpses, the impossible movements, the overwhelming sense of being watched. As we talked, a mixture of relief and fresh fear washed over me. I wasn't losing my mind, but that meant that something truly unexplainable was up there on the mountain. We never spoke of that night to anyone else. Who would believe us? Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if it was all some kind of shared hallucination, a result of altitude and exhaustion. But in my darker moments, when the wind howls outside my window and the shadows seem to move, I remember those glowing eyes on the ice face. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that there are things on this earth that defy explanation, things that live in the high, lonely places, watching and waiting. I still climb. The mountains are in my blood, and I can't stay away. But I never do night ascents anymore, and whenever I'm on a peak, I find myself scanning the shadows, watching for movement at the edge of my vision, hoping I don't see it, but knowing that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of ice and stone, it's watching me.